Thank you for joining us for this digital ethnography session with Professor Simone Natale. He will present materials from his new monograph, Deceitful Media, Artificial Intelligence and Social Life After the Turing Test. A little housekeeping. We are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. Pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time. These will be answered at the end of the talk. And please keep questions as concise as possible. These will be visible to all attendees and we will endeavour to follow up any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce David and Simone.
Hello, everyone. Before we get going on today's event, I wanted to flag the OxDEG seminar for 2 weeks' time, which will be the final session of the term, and it's going to be our third methods surgery. So if any of the students there have particular methodological issues that they want to discuss, please bring them with them, and ideally actually contact us in advance, but we can do things on the fly. So yeah, methods in 2 weeks' time and an open discussion about all sorts of digital methods. So today, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Professor Natale. What I particularly like about his CV is that he comes to digital ethnography and digital issues having discussed things like 19th century photographs of ectoplasm. I think that worrying about what a fake photograph looks like in the 19th century gives an interestingly different perspective to thinking about what different forms of digital fakery, how those can be conceptualized. And similarly, thinking about issues of religion, spirituality, online, offline, I think is a really good starting point. He is a grant holder and has been a lecturer at the University of Loughborough, now at the University of Turin, and is talking about Turing tests. So over to you, Simone.
Thank you, David, and thank you also to the Oxford Digital Ethnography Group and the Oxford Internet Institute for inviting me today. I will start to share my presentation. So for a talk about artificial intelligence, I will start with an anecdote that at first glance doesn't have much to do with AI, but I'll ask you to just give me the benefit of the doubt, and I will try to make clear how this relates to the topic of our talk today. So we are in the middle of the 19th century, and a new religious movement called spiritualism starts to attract the attention of the press and the public, first in the United States and then also in other countries around the world, including Great Britain. Believers in spiritualism, this new religious movement, believed that they were able to communicate with the spirit of the dead by joining spirit circles called seances, where they would create a channel to communicate with the beyond. Such was the attention that this new movement had attracted in the press and in the public, that one of the leading scientific figures of the time, Michael Faraday, decided in 1853 to start investigating the matter. So he set up to investigate seances by conducting experiments and by observing seances. Many thought that Faraday would be the ideal person to study spiritualism because he was an expert in electromagnetism. And many believed, professed that actually the phenomena that were observed as seances, such as movements of tables, movements of objects, and other physical phenomena, were to be explained with things such as electricity and magnetism. However, Faraday's investigation into the matter led him to a different conclusion, to a different interpretation of these events. In fact, at the end of the investigation, he pointed out that the source of all these phenomena that were observed as seances had not to do much with external forces such as electricity and magnetism, but instead, to understand what was happening there, one had to consider the role that the human participants in the seance, so the sitters, so-called sitters, were playing in it. Faraday concluded, in fact, that the movements of the seance table were caused by the sitters who sometimes unconsciously, in the case of blatant fraud, but also unconsciously, were producing the phenomena. Unconsciously because they desired in a way that the phenomena happened, and conducted these were the cause of these table movements and other physical phenomena. In other words, Faraday pointed out that it wasn't the spirits of the dead who made spiritualism, but it was instead living people. In other words, we, the humans, who had made it. So why I am taking up the case of Faraday and spiritualism to talk about AI? Because I believe that we need for artificial intelligence a similar shift of interpretation and focus as Faraday did for spiritualism. So usually the debates about AI focus on what the machine is able to achieve and how more and more sophisticated system will provide what they call AI. But another potential point of view is to look at actually the role of humans in projecting and adding meaning to what is considered as artificial, as machine intelligence. So I will follow this trace with the inspiration of Faraday's anecdote in this presentation, presenting some materials from the book that is about to be published in the next weeks for Oxford University Press, which is called Deceitful Media, Artificial Intelligence and Social Life After the Turing Test. In this book, I look at the historical trajectory of artificial intelligence from its origins with the Turing Test to Siri and Alexa, so to contemporary manifestation of AI. And I will argue that the development of AI not only was based on the development of more and more sophisticated technologies, but also on the collection of knowledge about how users responded to machines that were exhibiting intelligence. And I will try to show how this knowledge was integrated into AI through a dynamic that I propose to call banal deception. It's important to start before starting to consider one issue that so as many of you certainly know, there are a lot of technologies that go under the name of AI. So it's important to try to make so to give some detail of which kind of AI we are talking. So in this presentation, in my work, I'm focused in particularly on what has been called communicative AI, which are AI programs and interfaces that enter in communication with users. These include things such as voice assistants, chatbots, and other that communicate in natural language with humans, but also a broader range of program software systems that enter in interaction with human users. And in this sense, I follow the suggestion of some such as Andrea Guzman and David Gunkel and others, who point out that we should refuse the rigid distinction between communication and interaction, for the reason that any interaction between humans and machine also entails the establishment of communication dynamics into it. One of the implications of focusing on communicative AI is that in order to understand communicative AI, in order to understand also this kind of AI, we need to consider the history, the historical trajectory of AI, but also the historical trajectory of communication media. Especially because if AI becomes a medium of communication, it is important, so the history of media can help to understand better this technology. And for this reason, I will start my presentation with some aspects of media histories also before the digital, to tackle after that more precisely the history of AI up to the very present. So let's start with media history, and even before the invention of digital computers. So what I think it is particularly interesting is to look at the relationship between media and deception. And my key consideration in this regard is that deception is central to the very functioning of media technologies. And with this statement, I do not want to imply that media are forcefully manipulating machines and we are all part of a great conspiracy of manipulation from the media, although, of course, this vision has recently gained much appeal within some. What I want to argue instead, it's a different thing, is that media are built to adapt to our senses and intellect. And this adaptation of media, the fact that media are constructed, developed against the human sensorium and intellect, is also entails the fact that dynamics of deception that are normalized and mundane are integrated within the functioning of media technologies. And specific physiological and psychological characteristics of us, of humans, are exploited to achieve aesthetic or functional effects. So let's make, for instance, I describe this mechanism, this dynamic, as banal deception. Because deception is often used as a negative term that is linked to malicious intents and to exceptional circumstances, such as, for instance, a blatant fraud or lying or fake truth, other fake news. However, deception can also be mundane, normalized, in other words, also banal. And in fact, there are scholars in cognitive sciences that have argued that deception is ingrained and actually inseparable from perception. For instance, Donald Hoffman, who published in 2019 a book entitled The Case Against Reality, has argued that evolution has shaped our perception into what he calls useful illusions that help us navigate reality. An example we can make of us, of me going for a walk in the wood, and at a certain moment I see something that I think it's a deer or another animal. So I turn, but I see that actually just a bush with a strange shape. In this case, of course, I am deceived. However, the same mechanism that led me to this deception would have maybe saved me against a potential threat, such as a wild animal in another circumstances. So this kind of deception also has a functional role in our perception. So in this sense, I propose this concept of banal deception as the normalization of deception in media technologies, and argue that all modern media since at least the 19th century employ to some extent deception to achieve specific effects. So let us make the example, for instance, of cinema. Cinema was introduced at the end of the 19th century, but its introduction was the result of long studies about the functioning of perception and that were conducted during the 19th century, particularly regarding the illusion of movement, but not only. In this sense, cinema can be seen as being built against and for the characteristic of human sensory. As for instance, one of the founding pioneers of film theory, Hugo Musterberg, who was at the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, the director of the psychological laboratory at Harvard, pointed out. He looked at different elements of cinema, exploited fallacies and elements of human perception. What is interesting is that this deception of our sensing actually has a functional reason, is a functional effect. It makes it possible for audiences, for us, to enjoy the cinematic spectacle, to immerse and feel emotions while we are watching a movie. Another example that can be done is sound media. Also, sound recording, not differently from cinema, emerged at the end of the 19th century from studies about human physiology, especially about human hearing. And as for instance, Jonathan Stern has argued. And indeed, the very format of analog sound reproduction media and later of digital audio files such as MP3 was calibrated to the ears of human listeners. For instance, some MP3 takes up to compress a file, takes out all sound waves that are not perceivable by the human ear. These processes sometimes take quite literal manifestation. For instance, the phonoautograph of Bell, an early sound recording device, incorporated a part of an ear and of the skull of a dead man to record graphically sound. So there was a literal incorporation of part of the body with media. And as media incorporated parts of the body, they also incorporated the possibility of fallacies of deception and make it a fruitful component that can lead to aesthetic effects. For instance, to the immersion of audiences in a spectacle of cinema. To define banal deception, I identify 5 main characteristics. The first characteristic is the everyday and ordinary character, the fact that banal deception disappears in the everyday and the mundane. So in contrast with straight out deception that is seen as an exceptional event. The second characteristic is its functionality. Banal deception always has some potential value to the user or to audiences. Again, the possibility to immerse in the product of fiction has a value to the audience. Third characteristic is obliviousness. Banal deception is usually not understood as such as deception, but is instead taken for granted and unquestioned. The fourth characteristic is the so-called low definition. I use this term taken from media theory, particularly from McLuhan but others, to point to the fact that banal deception demands participation from audiences and users, which has the implication also that the user should not be understood as passive or naive, as it is usually the case when an element of straight-out deception is involved. The fifth characteristic, which is also important and will be particularly important for when you take into account artificial intelligence, is the programmability of banal deception. The fact that this can be anticipated and to some extent programmed by designers and developers. So now that we have used the history and the theory of media in order to define this concept of banal deception, let us see how this enters, how this is relevant to the history of AI. And to start, I will take one of what is considered one of the points of origins of AI, which is the so-called Turing Test, originally called the imitation game, which was proposed by Alan Turing in a paper published in 1950. So at the very beginning of computer science, when it wasn't, they weren't already talking about AI, but they were talking about machine intelligence. So Turing started this very famous paper with the question, can machines think? However, with a quite interesting rhetorical move, as soon as he introduced this question, he said he dismissed this question. He said that this question is useless because basically we couldn't agree on what thinking means. So he proposes a substitute to this question, and the substitute is the imitation game or the Turing test. I'll explain how this the Turing test worked. Basically, we have one interrogator. Here is C that enters in conversation with different agents through a teleprinter. So today would be through a chat room. This interrogator cannot see who its interlocutor is. The only thing that the interrogator can do is having a conversation through the chat with this agent. And at the end of this conversation, has to establish if he or she was talking with a human or with a computer. If the computer manages to trick the interrogator in a statistically consistent way into believing it is human, then it will have passed the Turing test. So the Turing test is often discussed in terms of its threshold. So where if this threshold is accurate in terms of a description of what AI is, or if it's useful. However, one of the elements that I think makes the Turing test most interesting and actually actual today is the role that deception plays in the test. The computer, in fact, passes the Turing test if it can deceive the human interrogator into believing that it is human. And by placing deception at the center of this test, of this imitation game, Turing made something quite interesting about AI. He, in a way, he showed that what we call artificial intelligence or machine intelligence at the time is to do with our perception of computing technology, a perception that can be manipulated through deceptive practices. So if we consider again the example of Faraday that I made at the beginning, let's try to compare this with what Turing did. Faraday shifted the interpretation, the focus from the external forces that might have created these these physical phenomena at seances to the role of humans in the seances. In a similar way, Turing shifted the emphasis from it being only solely in what the computer achieves, what the computer does, to it being shared between the computer and the humans. In fact, the outcome of the test, as it can become apparent if we see this diagram, depends, of course, on what the machine, the computer does, but also at the same time on what humans involved in this experiment also do. And of course, an interrogator that has more knowledge or more skills, for instance, in computing, might be more likely to find out that the computer is actually a computer and not a human. So elements such as human bias and knowledge and skills are components that decide if the machine passes the test or not. So the perception, the role of humans becomes central to understand AI. There are also, however, some limitations in how Turing pointed to this direction. The key limitation is that Turing posed this idea that we can be deceived and we can project humanity to machines as a kind of a binary choice. The interrogator has to decide if this is a human or a computer. However, this kind of mechanism doesn't reflect what happens in most everyday interaction with AI, but we are not asked to decide if we are talking to a human or to a computer, but we do different things. We just maybe interact with software or such as voice assistants without having to decide in such binary ways. In this sense, it is interesting to follow the thread of the relationship between AI and deception, and in particular banal deception, to look at some practical experiences with this. And in this sense, I will take up one example, which is the creation of the first chatbot, a computer program that can enter in conversation with through a chat with other users or other chatbots. The invention of the first chatbot at Massachusetts Institute of Technology by Joseph Weizenbaum in the 1960s. So this case is quite interesting. At the time, in the 1960s, artificial intelligence programming wasn't much advanced. So what Eliza was able to do was quite limited. However, Weizenbaum understood a quite important and interesting thing about how Eliza could be created. He understood that in our conversations, we decide, it's not only the issue of what is written in a conversation that counts, but it's also how we project a social role or a social identity to our interlocutor. So if Joseph Weizenbaum realized that if you create also a character in the chatbots, very much like in theater, then it will be much more credible than in other cases. So he presented Eliza as the character of a psychotherapist, with the idea that a psychotherapist can just ask questions without adding much to the conversation, and this could be seen as credible within the context, the frame of this conversation. For instance, if one mentions the word mother, the program takes up this keyword and asks something like, tell me more about your mother, or tell me more about your family. So Weizenbaum actually thought that his Eliza, his chatbot, could be in a way a source of rationalization of AI and computing. In fact, he predicted that Eliza would have tricked some users, but only temporarily. until its inner working were revealed. He wrote, quote, that once a particular program is a must, once its inner workings are explained in language sufficiently plain to induce understanding, its magic crumbles away. So I thought that this the deception could have been exceptional, but then it could lead also to better understanding of the system. However, what happened before surprised Weizmann, and in a way disappointed his rationalizing and illuministic frame that he had considered at the beginning. And there is a famous anecdote about Eliza and Weizmann, which was told by Weizmann himself. Weizmann told the story of his secretary, who of course knew very well that Eliza was a program and not a human. But one day, Weizmann tell us, she wanted Weizmann to go out of the room while she was talking with Eliza, because this it was private matters, and Weizmann was surprised by this by what happened. Some like Sherry Tarkle, however, point out that how Weizmann's secretary acted actually is quite representative of how we act often with AI. In fact, Tarkle points out that Eliza was fascinating not only because it was lifelike, but because it made people aware of their own desire to breathe life into the machine. And in this sense, it can remind us of the characteristic of banal deception, the fact that it becomes ordinary, something that you can chat with, the fact that there's a potential value because there is a playfulness or that makes it valuable to be able to forget for a moment of this of the distinction between human and machines. The fact that it is not understood as such, so that it is this obliviousness. Low definition, the fact that it requires users to project and to add meaning to Eliza, because Eliza itself provided very little information, new information, and also its programmability. The fact that these characteristics can, to some extent, anticipate and programmed by designers and developers. So, although, of course, users are always able, as in the case of Weizmann, to subvert these plans, this anticipation. And then let's move now to the third and last part of my presentation, which looks at a technology that we know well because we can encounter it in our everyday life. Voice assistants such as Amazon's Alexa and Apple Siri. Well, first, it's interesting that Siri, or I should say, developers, Apple developers who scripted some parts of some language of Siri, actually acknowledge the legacy of Eliza. When you ask, do you know Eliza? At least when I did it, Siri answered me, Eliza is my good friend. She was a brilliant psychiatrist, but she's retired now. So voice assistants have become recently quite successful and spread technology that we use to make things such as turn on and off a light, but also to access the web, information on the web, play music and other things. It's interesting that we can see that voice assistants take up elements of banal deception. In fact, there are studies about voice assistants show that users know perfectly well that assistants are not human. So they don't fail in a kind of deception such as the binary deception of Turing Test. But at the same time, they still apply social frameworks and habits to relate with these machines. What are the features, for instance, of voice assistants that show that banal deception is in place? For instance, the choice to use a humanized voice. Of course, it was also possible to select a synthetic voice, but developers chose to use a humanized voice because it would make it easier for users to integrate these within their domestic environments. Another example is gender. There has been a lot of debate about that, but also because it was pointed out by many that voice assistants replicate stereotypes of gender and representation of gender. However, what is interesting is that the choice of most developers has been to decide a particular gender, and as actual statements made by developers of this system show, this was based on a decision that was based on their own understanding of how users would react to different genders in the voice. Of course, this can be totally wrong and bad science, but certainly these where this understanding of how humans react to gender was involved in the decision to, for instance, to make the female gender as default in Alexa. Also, the name, of course, the fact that you attribute a name to this software also has implications in this sense. And finally, an interesting one is the characterization, the fact that all these different voice assistant sets have a slightly different characterization. For instance, Siri uses more irony than Google Assistant, and this also fits with the overall corporate image of Apple as based on creativity and so, and also its marketing campaigns that often make use of irony. What is interesting is that this use of irony is often seen as by users as a kind of evidence of how incredible this technology works. However, this is arguably the most simple thing that this software do, the voice assistants do, because it is based on scripting. So they have teams of creative writers who can access, of course, data about previous questions and will write potential canned responses that make use of irony. So it is technically the easiest thing, but it still can have a kind of effect on users. So what if we consider again this idea of banal deception? There are several dynamics that are involved in voice assistance that we can conceptualize as such. For instance, the fact that users participate in the production of meaning. So through the uses of stereotypes that are created through things such as the voice, the name, not only gender stereotype, but also class and race stereotypes that people have to add their own representation about this in the system. And in general, Alexa, Siri are not represented visually by this company. So that users can and should add their own imagination when interacting. The second interesting thing is the effect of this value, this functionality, as I put it earlier, for the user. All these elements of banal deception makes it easier to incorporate the software into their domestic and everyday life. They can be problematic, but at the same time, they still have a value for the user. And finally, the normalization of deception that is not dissolved in the everyday and is not understood as such. In contrast to cases of straight out deception, for instance, with Google Duplex, that has been another system that has been at the center of a wider discussion about deception. So in this case, so in most cases, what happens with voice assistance is not understood explicitly as deception. So in conclusion, in the last days, you might have seen that the Mars rover called Perseverance, that recently landed in Mars, also had a Twitter account and posted some quite lovely messages from Mars, like this one, for instance. This idea, this marketing idea of NASA, attracted some controversy. Some pointed out that this was deception because it actually invited users to anthropomorphize, this robot, this rover, although it was actually naturally, of course, just a script. So the fact that also the first person is used, so invited users to do that, to anthropomorphize. So what I point out with my work and with my presentation is that actually we should go beyond this rigid, simple dichotomy between authenticity and deception in looking at cases like this. Because an alternative approach is to consider that deception is actually as central to AI's functioning as the circuits, the software, and the data that make it run. And in this sense, the point in the controversy about perseverance, but in many other controversies about AI, is not to understand if deception is involved, because deception is ingrained in the functioning of this machine whenever interaction with users is involved. But it is instead to try to assess what are the outcomes and what is the potential impact of this deception. Why is this important? The first reason why it is important to look at banal deception is that the same mechanisms that underpin banal deception can be used also for straight out deception. Examples are many. Of course, for instance, uses of bots in social media is one clear method, but also, for instance, some have pointed out that voice assistant could be used in the future for marketing purposes, and they could also mobilize our feeling of empathy with so a humanized voice to make this marketing more effective. Second reason why it is important is that interaction with AI and robots that mobilize the dynamics of banal deception change how people understand and perceive machine. So by creating a feedback loop that impacts finally on our habits and practices. And this, again, I can point to the work of Sherry Tarkel, who conducted interviews with people that were interacting about their opinions on AI at different moments of time. And she showed quite clearly that while at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, people were quite skeptical about the idea of a psychotherapist chatbot, later on they became more willing to accept this. This suggests that our integration also of banal deception of AI in our everyday life changes how we think and then also how we interact with these machines. And finally, the third reason why it is important is that it is important that users develop an informed, skeptical stance towards AI, not only by knowing better how AI functions, but also by knowing better how our own perception, our known fallacies function and can be exploited. And in this sense, I pointed at the beginning of the talk to the example of Faraday. Exactly how Faraday moved the attention from electricity, from external forces that might have caused spiritualism, to the role of humans in spiritualism. We also have to consider not only the role of machines, but also how we are involved in contributing to creating the effect and the outcome of artificial intelligence. And I was thinking about Faraday and its interpretation of spiritualism the other day when I took up my phone and I asked, "Hey Siri, but do you believe in spirits?" To which Siri, quite enigmatically, replied, "I don't believe that I have beliefs." Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Simone. That was a really fascinating talk, and I can't wait to read the book. I think we've got a great amount of time for some questions, and I'm sure there's lots of questions that people want to ask. So if you haven't already, please do feel free to add some questions to the chat, and we can have a discussion about it. We already have some questions from the panel, so I think I'll start with one from the panel and then move to the audience. So Bill, do you want to come in first?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so thank you for a really intriguing talk. It reminded me of so many things. I've been reading a little bit of Brian Pfaffenberger on socio-technical nexus, the anthropologist, and we've had Lucy Suchman speak in this seminar about a slightly different aspect, but very closely related. You know, the sort of, again, the socio-technical, the human and the technical. So it's a really fascinating, interesting contribution to this conversation, ongoing conversation. My question is specifically, I mean, I wanted to pick up something fairly specific that you talked about, which was voice, because that's a really intriguing area. And one can imagine the discussions that must go on in making decisions about what this voice should be. Because if you think of the non-technical aspect of this, I mean, the way society has moved is towards integrating more diverse voices in our everyday life, you know. So I have to take an example of the BBC, you know, what used to be BBC language, BBC English has become much more diversified, you know, integrating accents and regional and even ethnic sort of voices into the presentation of news and information, etc. But with these things, I was just wondering, I don't know how deeply you've looked into this particular aspect, but is the, you know, what is the aims of deciding what the voice should be with something like Siri or Alexa? Is it to find a neutral, you know, I'm thinking, for example, in the North American case, you know, Ohio is always mentioned as sort of the closest we have to standard American English. So is it to find a kind of neutral center ground that doesn't really upset various sectors of society or upsets the fewest sectors? Or is it to maybe, is there a conversation about bringing in different technical voices? Because one could imagine that, you know, subsectors of society might respond better to a different voice in Siri or Alexa. So I'm just wondering if there's any way to elaborate on that conversation at all and to think about what a technical you know, voice should look like, or should there be multiple technical voices? That's my question.
Thank you very much, Bill. Yeah, that's a great question, because the problem of voice is really also a long history that goes much beyond artificial intelligence. And so what is certain is that all these companies haven't taken this issue of the voice lightly. And they actually saw there are some interesting inputs that might be gained from the work of developers. Though of course a lot of things is hidden. But for instance, one of the developers of Cortana has pointed out that there were controversy and discussions about the issue of to assign a gender to the voice, because it could also be possible to have a more neutral. But this was deemed not a good choice, because in a way it was deemed that users needed a clear element that could in a way make them project meaning, and this is interesting. And about the accent, well, one thing is that so we had at the beginning, so some of these systems were offered as a default or even unique voice, very clear one, yeah. But then there has been much more plurality. Now you can, in many of the systems, in all of the systems, you can choose, and sometimes they give by default not just one gender, but they give more plurality. Yeah? And this also is related to the fact that there were, of course, debates about these issues, and the companies responded by so providing like more diversity. You can choose different accents and so on. Yeah? I think that about what you suggest about the neutral voice is interesting, but I think in a way there is no neutral voice, and you know there are studies also that show that this any kind of voice bring within suggestion about not only gender but also race, class, that are so then integrated in one particular voice input. So there is on the one side this I think now they are kind of trying to find a balance between the need of responding to criticism that they attracted, and on the other side they continue to do what they do. They try to understand how users react to different inputs, including different kinds of voices, and this so is the basis for their choices about how to implement and which kind of voices.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I guess even vocabulary could be a very complicated issue. What words should we be using for maximum encompassment of, you know? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just going to take one from the audience and then come back to you, David, if that's all right. So our first question is, smartphones today are extremely intertwined with our lives. I mostly feel that AI enables the phone to hear us all the time and thus invading into our privacy. Do you think it is a modern day deceptive media engagement with the user?
That's a great question. And of course, this is one it's been a point of concern to many, and also because it is often not possible to understand, to know for certain, yeah, to what extent these speakers and recorders, because they call them smart speakers, but actually they are also recorders, are listening to us, yeah, in which situation and so on. Yeah? So there is certainly an element of fear or concern about privacy, and there's been evidence that staff in different companies have actually listened to individual conversations of users that were recorded through these smart speakers. One other interesting element is that all these data are used to also to prepare potential other answers to the machine. So, for instance, there are always teams of creative writers that also create these canned responses, and they are able to find the right responses. For instance, they are able to find a response about Siri, about like my question about spirits, also because they know that other people are asking these questions. So in a way, all these collection of our data, of course, adds to the knowledge that the machine, so that developers have on ourselves. And also this knowledge is transformed into statistical patterns that are elaborated by the machines itself, which has quite interesting quite interesting potential implications also if we consider this issue of banal deception, because this construction of knowledge about users as central to the functioning of artificial intelligence has always been based on humans creating knowledge about users and then adapted it anticipating how users might react and trying to incorporate this knowledge into the machines. Here we see also that machines are developing knowledge about human behaviors and then are incorporated in the way in which machines can interact with us. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the answer. It's great. David, do you want to ask your question next?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a really intriguing talk. I realize now that in introducing you, I should have set the scene by introducing you as a robot, which would have challenged the audience in all sorts of ways. Right, what I like a lot in what you've said is the way that you're emphasizing the role of the people here, the people who are doing the interacting. You talked about the interrogators or the users, and how it's really their active participation that is key here. So the idea that video is an example of banal deception because I can't not see it as continuous movement, even though I know it's just a succession of still images. I think that's really useful. But I do worry then about the word deception. Would it be safer to talk about projection, and that rather than talking about banal, we keep deception for when there is kind of conscious manipulation, and contrast that with banal projection. So that's one question. The other is whether well, it's kind of really feeding on your asking Siri if what they believe in. I'm really unsure whether belief is a good analytical category. And so maybe we should always be using it in inverted commas as a subject to be studied, but not in the language of belief. And maybe one of the things coming out of your talk then is that we should apply the same to intelligence. There's no such thing as intelligence. There are lots and lots of different contexts in which people intersect with machines and interact with other humans, and we are continually worrying about how much intelligence, or is there any intelligence in the interactions? And maybe then one effect of that is to say, well, intelligence isn't a very helpful word. So two very big questions. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for these challenging questions, which I think they are very important. And indeed, I also, when I was working the last years on this book, on this project, I actually took into account this issue. Yeah, so maybe projection is a better term and so on. And I decided that actually deception was better for two key reasons. One reason is that so projection, also like illusion, doesn't involve also considering who, so the possibility of someone deceiving. And of course, like as mentioned, there is always this active role of users. So it's not about the fact that you have a magic bullet, yeah, that's someone is. But at the same time, I think that it is important to remember that there are developers making specific choices about so the design of machines, so that some element is involved. So it's not about just the mechanism of projection that everybody has, but it's also about like an agency that of course it's really hard to identify, because we also have to consider many ways. We cannot project intention on the developers when we don't have evidence. We cannot know what happens actually in the actual situation. But what we can certainly do is to know that there is an agency. Before the vision, there is someone trying to make choices of this kind and incorporating strategies of this kind. So this is the first reason. The second reason is that what I want to argue is not for the for the fact that we don't have to use deception in the same way as we do it before, but that instead of having like a very binary, rigid distinction, dichotomy between authenticity and deception, we should consider more a kind of continuum, a kind of continuity, where we see forms that are certainly more nuanced, that I call banal deception on the one side, and other forms that I call outright or strong deception on the other side. And I think it's important to consider this continuity because it helps us to understand also better the forms of outright deception, which are often based on the same mechanisms that are involved in these other forms, more nuanced and more everyday mundane forms of deception. And then the second question, which is also a great question, and I agree about the topic of belief. I'm not a scholar in religious studies, but I worked a lot in my work on religion, and I agree that this has a lot to do with practices, and so the word belief often doesn't capture the complexity of this, and also what you say about intelligence, and indeed. In a way, one of the implications of these, what I try to argue today, but also of what Turing had done in 1950, was that we cannot define intelligence in absolute terms, but we can only define intelligence in relative terms. And there are also works in psychology in philosophy of cognition, for instance, that support these. There is a famous paper about how a bat thinks. How can we understand how a bat thinks, or we would say also feel? We can't understand a bat even if we have a description, a perfect description of what happens in the head of the bat. We need to be inside the animal in order really to know, if it thinks. So there is this element that we can always define. So we can make all kinds of thresholds for when we will reach human level intelligence or super intelligence. But at the end, it will be to us to decide if something is intelligent or not. There will always be some relative. And these points I think to what you are suggesting, to the fact that intelligence shouldn't be defined or understood in absolute terms, but more in relative terms.
Thank you. I'll just add for students listening that article, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, is also partly about what is it, it's mainly about seeing through hearing, as it were, and the argument is the technical term is qualia, the feel of perceiving space through echoes as opposed to perceiving space through visible light. And if you take that sort of argument seriously, then AI can't be deemed to be sentient because it's silicon based, not wetware. And I mean, there's a huge philosophical argument about that, which, well, I mean, I suppose this topic does intersect with, but there are also these wider philosophical issues that Simone knows quite well, but I'm saying this really for the students. I'll shut up at that point.
Thank you so much, David.
That's great, thank you. We're also getting some great questions in the chat. So I'm just going to read a couple out because I think they link quite nicely together with just some of the things we've just talked about. So the first one is, how do we identify banal deception? And relatedly, second question is, how do we measure the potential impact of forms of banal deception in AI? Do you think this should be measured case by case, or with regards to the impact on the anthropomorphism of our broader cultural expectations of AI?
Thank you very much. This is an important question, and so well, I think that so there is again well, first it's about the issue of agency that it's always hard to establish, but it's important in a way to create question, to question so what the developers are doing, to have developers reflect and question so the implications, the wider implication of these characteristics. And in general terms, I'd say that so first, banal deception can be identified by considering aspects of human perceptions and how they can enter in artificial intelligence. So again, the key thing is that we need at the same time to know better how these systems work, because of course more knowledge into their functioning will help us to understand so the interaction and the issues that are related to it. But at the same time, we need to understand our own fallacies and our own mechanism of perception. So it's important in a way to, and these are actually is writing in more general terms to our relationship with media. So the fact that we can be more informed users of different media, including artificial intelligence, but also, for instance, social media, by knowing better so the dynamics that are mobilized in our interaction. And the second issue is, how can we measure particular effects of banal deception? Certainly, so again, these are very different technologies. So it is so if you take, for instance, voice assistants or chatbots, so they are very different technologies. So we have to consider the specificity of all these systems. I think that one key issue is to consider the results, the outcomes of the interaction, and how these effects of deception so actually provide the specific outcomes. So, for instance, if we take into account this example of the Perseverance and the Twitter account of Perseverance, here we have something that certainly has an element of banal deception, and some say also like is problematic, an element of deception in general. However, so first, it actually so it is, if we look at it, it is actually a quite normal use of social media. So, for instance, even public personalities might have managers and agents writing their own post, and this might be exchanged for something that is written by this celebrity, and this might have an effect on of course on users. So in a way, this is a quite normal approach to the platform. So we could consider also the particular platforms in which are used. And so in other words, it's I'd say that it's very important to consider the particular cases and also the particular environments and technologies that are that go with it.
That's great, thank you. And that conversation has sparked even more questions in the chat, so I hope we managed to get through them all. Lots of also nice comments about the presentation, how much people have enjoyed it, so just to note that as well. But the next question is, would you say that your project depicts media history as a history of the human desire towards the anthropomorphization of communication and media technologies? I'm thinking of sound recording devices, including human ears, as you said, the imitation of human voice in AI systems, and your final comment on the humanized tweet from Perseverance.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and well, it reminds me of a very nice book by John Durham Peters, which is called "Speaking into the Air." I think a history of the concept of communication, the subtitle, and in this Peters so makes a long history of the concept of communication and argues that our relationship with communication has always been shaped by the desire to establishing an empathic connection to the other, and the fear of the breaking of this connection. And in this sense, some of the mechanisms that lead users to anthropomorphize so these tools so is quite relevant. Another interesting element that I think it's media history can provide to discussion of AI is the crucial role of playfulness and entertainment. The fact that so for instance, many of these responses that Siri, Alexa make are based also on the idea that there can be a playful engagement with this machine, and in general studies about how users perceive these technologies show that users rarely take into account more metaphysical question about the distinction between humans and machines that sometimes are at the center of these debates about AI, and instead make much more mundane questions, and so such as, for instance, if I can speak to Siri in the presence of others, and so on. Yeah? And in this sense, so there is this aspect that might look less important because they are more everyday, but are actually quite important. And this playfulness, this entertaining aspect, this desire to breathe life into the machine is one of the elements, an element that is characterized the whole history of media, so that we can certainly find in this context.
That's really helpful, thank you. Yeah, it's such an interesting topic, isn't it? So many dimensions to it. So our next one is, like the spiritualists, are we at risk of imagining a separate independent consciousness on AI computers? Could this turn into a form of idolatry or worship? Is this dangerous?
That's a very interesting question, and not one that I will answer, or anyone will answer in full. But so of course, there is a lot of debate on the issue of consciousness. One of the dimensions of this debate is that, as I mentioned before, it's very hard to define what is consciousness in absolute terms and in terms that can be measured. Yeah. So much also depends on how we perceive and how we attribute these. But at the same time, in the question, you also mentioned the issue of potential reactions to it, including so seeing machines as deities or others. And of course, it's hard to speculate about that. But what is certain is that our relationship with machine has changed historically and will continue to change in the past. And I mentioned before in the talk shortly, briefly about Sherry Turkle work. Sherry Turkle work is a great point of reference, but it's also interesting because she conducted research across a long time span on AI, and she noted that so, for instance, people in the late 70s and early 80s in interviews were quite negative about psychotherapy chatbot. They were saying, it's important, this empathy between the therapist and the patient is too important, and so on. Yeah? Later on, 1 or 2 decades later, interviewees being asked the same question were much more willing to say, well, if it can help, then so why not? So there is certainly a change, and along as so this technology enter into the everyday, into our own also identity and habits. So these can also change in a very so important way. So it's hard to predict how our own our own perception, our imagination will change in the past. The important thing is that we don't not just focus on how AI may develop in the future, but we also focus on how our own role may change in the future, our own perception, projection, and so will change in the future.
That's so interesting. Thank you. It's really helpful. And if I may, as I'm asking the questions, perhaps also ask one as well. So I'm from a more education background, so I'm always thinking about this from a kind of educational perspective. And I've certainly been very interested in how we can use kind of conversational agents for people to support their learning, even if the agent is not that clever. It helps people reflect and it helps them articulate their goals. And, the intersections between the agent and the human can be super interesting in terms of what that creates. But then on the other hand, I think there's this kind of a big question around media literacy and thinking about, how when we start to realize what AI can actually do and kind of critiquing AI and being clear about that and thinking about someone, for example, on the Q&As, it's sort of reinforcing the conversation we had earlier about questions of gender and inequality and how they might promote ways of thinking, that are potentially problematic. How do we balance those two things as kind of literate individual while also kind of getting the benefits from kind of working with AI or kind of believing in it in perhaps ways that make it more intelligent in highlights than we normally do? So is there a balance for you or is it quite straightforward?
Thank you, Rebecca. That's a great question, and I share with you this kind of ambivalence that I think it's so it's part of also what I was mentioning before about the continuity between forms of deception that are more innocuous and can be even leading to specific effects that also add to the user and for instance also to its to potential application in education and others. But at the same time also the fact that this similar mechanism can also be used for so negative in potentially malicious ways. Yeah, so there is an ambivalence that I think we'll never lose, and that is part of our relationship with technology. Has always been and we'll always have to live with that. But in a way, one important thing that could be improved is first the transparency. Of course, a lot of these technologies are owned and managed by big corporations, and this makes it harder for us to know how these work and to have an impact on these. This can be potentially can have very negative effects. For instance, one of the ways in which we use voice assistants is to access the web, to make searches and so on. Yeah, to have the voice assistant make search on our behalf, and of course this means that the voice assistants that are managed by these corporations gain control over the kinds of contents that are offered to users. And this becomes even more important because while in a Google search on a browser, we will have a multiplicity of results, a voice assistant will give usually one or a smaller number of results. So it becomes even more likely that the attention is led towards specific contents, and this can even make it bigger. This kind of impossibility to distinguish between the web and the corporative cloud of Amazon, of Google, and Apple. So I think that it's important to gain more and more transparency. Also, to at the same time to make sure that more understanding of these technologies is that we can develop informed uses of these technologies. Thank you.
That's super interesting. Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so we're almost out of time, but I know Bill had one more question he'd like to ask. And I think then that's our last question before we close, but thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much again. So I'm not so sure if it's a question or maybe just a reframing really of the entire talk in a sense, but it seems to me it's kind of building on my comments on voice earlier, because I work on Japan, and I'm interested in technology in Japan a little bit, and there one of the aims is to create technologies that will simulate humans in a fairly invisible way to provide companionship for the elderly and things of that sort. And that means their reactions become naturalized, and they become less and less alien and less, and maybe that's a problem, because as they become less machine-like, that problem of transparency might become a little bit more complicating. If you take the example of voice, if you're always using the computerized voice, in a way it clarifies this, because it's not merging with the human, you avoid all the problems of ethnicity, potentially gender, and those sorts of things, because it maintains its mechanical status. So I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, because that seems like another, I think it's the same thing you're talking about, of course, but another dimension where the deception is more, look how human I can be. I'm tapping into your most primal instincts, starting in Japan with the Tamagotchi, the toy that you take care of, but now really being elaborated through robotic technologies, the point of which is to become more and more less able to distinguish from the human, that sort of idea. I don't know if that makes sense, but that was my comment.
Thank you, Bill. That's a very interesting reflection, and the case of Tamagotchi in Japan is so is interesting. And one other dimension that we didn't mention, but is I talked about history, about the importance of considering historicize our behavior and our interaction and perception of machines, but this also is important, and at a cultural level. So we have to consider how different cultures also also attribute different ways. And I think that a lot of these of technologies tend towards this construction of simulations of human voices, of also human bodies, because we also have embodied AI such as robots, social robots, and so on. I believe that it is there is this kind of aspect of playfulness, and also of aspects of making it something that works for us. That is always so it is also important. And so, for instance, if you have a social robot, something that acts as a companionship and so on, you might be quite clear about the fact that this is a robot, but not not a human. But at the same time, being able to engage socially with the robot will have a value for you. So I think in a way that we cannot we can never reason in white or black terms, and we have to really consider how so what are the outcomes of this interaction, where this is leading us, and to some extent if this to control also that some of these mechanisms are not used, for instance, for political propaganda and so on. One interesting element, I mean, just to make an example, and then I will close. Well, an example is a chatbot. It was used by the campaign of Netanyahu in Israel a couple of years ago, and so Anat Ben-David, an Israeli media researcher, followed this case. This chatbot was on Facebook. And it was a chatbot that appeared as Netanyahu, but it clearly revealed that it wasn't Netanyahu itself. It was just a chatbot. And however, at the same time, one might think, only if it's really presented as Netanyahu itself will it be dangerous or so. But even if someone knows that this is not Netanyahu, the fact that it's still talks to you in as it was would be in a conversation as an effect. And in this sense, we have to remember that a lot of studies show that we are always more subject, for instance, to advertisement than we think to be. So we think to be resistant, to marketing and so on, and very often we are not. But subjectively, so even me, I will probably be more subject to the impact of advertisement and marketing than I think to be. And this, so of course, it's another element of the problem that also has to do with the ambivalence of these cases that you mentioned. Thank you again. Thank you all.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for such a fascinating talk and just brilliant, so many interesting questions. I think we could talk for a lot longer, but unfortunately we're just out of time. But all it leaves to me is just to say thank you so much again, Simone. That was a brilliant talk and we're very much looking forward to reading the book. And thank you to all of you for your great questions. And we do hope we see you in the student surgery on Monday of week 8. And I think, unless my colleagues have anything else to add, just to say thank you again very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.